All right, Matthew chapter 14 is where we're at. And it's at the end of this chapter where we see the disciples crossing the Sea of Galilee after they had just seen the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And as they're crossing over the water in the middle of the night, as they're in the boat, the disciples look out into the sea and they see what they think is a ghost walking across the water. But it turns out that it's Jesus. And then after Jesus assures them that it is indeed him, Peter, one of the disciples, decides to speak up. And in verse 28, here's what he says. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? What in the world was Peter thinking, right? I mean, clearly he wasn't, because once he realized what it was that he was attempting to do, he totally freaked out and started to sink. And why shouldn't he, right? He's trying to walk on water. Think of the risk involved in that. I mean, how many people do you know of who have ever done it? In the history of the world, how many people have ever successfully walked on water? My guess is it's a pretty small club. What was Peter thinking? And keep in mind, it's not like he's trying to do this in a heated pool in a Marriott somewhere. He's out in the open seas in the middle of a storm. And so if he goes over, it's over. See, that's why if I were Peter, my request of the Lord would be structured in such a way as to eliminate a lot of that risk. Lord, if it's you, if it's really you, then calm this wind and these waves until the water is as smooth as glass. Really thick glass. Thick enough to support the weight of an average full-grown adult male, and I will come to you. See? Yeah, you laugh, but how many times do we do that as Christians? How many times do we ask God to eliminate the risk as a sign of his calling? Lord, if it's really you, then cause that person to float across this crowded room and sit down next to me, and I will share my faith with them. Or Lord, if it's really you, then have my boss give me an extra week's vacation, paid of course, and a bonus, and I will go on that outreach to Cambodia. And then when our, quote, prayer isn't answered, we remain right where we are with a clear conscience, convinced that God never intended for us to step out of the boat in the first place. See how that works? How we choose to respond to risk in our lives not only affects what we do, but it affects our perspective as well. We go on living not even realizing that something is wrong. How we respond to risk directly affects our faith. And our faith affects our relationship with God. It affects our relationship with others. And it affects our ability as a church to be effective. So, yeah, not a whole lot at stake. Now, for me personally, I tend to rely a lot on wisdom and common sense, which are both good things, don't get me wrong, but I've also come to realize the importance of living a life of faith. The only thing is, how do I do that without being irresponsible, right? Because sometimes what God asks us to do doesn't always make sense. And that's where faith comes in. Now, as Christians, one of the ways that we try to eliminate risk in our lives is by trying to figure out if this thing that we're considering doing is God's idea or my idea. Because if it's God's idea, then it's much more likely to succeed, right, than if it's my idea. But let me ask you this. Whose idea was it to walk on water? It's Peter's, right? Now, Jesus agreed to it, but the idea was Peter's, which I think is so cool because Peter is about to walk on water not because Jesus commanded him to do it, but because he genuinely wants to do it. See, Peter's the one taking the initiative in this story. Now, make no mistake about it, the only reason it was even possible for even a moment was because Jesus agreed to it. But see, the whole thing would have never happened if Peter didn't open his mouth. See, most of us would have just sat in the boat and watched. Just sat there and been like, wow, look at that. Is that Jesus? He's walking on water. How cool is that? But the idea of actually going out there to meet him probably wouldn't have crossed our minds or our lips, and definitely not our feet. Now, some of you are thinking, okay, John, I think I get where you're going with this. I need to take some initiative in my life. I need to finally pull the trigger on that thing that I've been talking about for far too long. But see, all I'm really looking for is a word from the Lord. Whether it's God's idea or my idea, what I really need is a clear word from God so that when I do take this risk and do this thing, I know I won't fail. Well, wait a minute. Peter had a word from the Lord, right? I mean, it was only one word, but it was a good word and a very clear word. Come. Jesus said, come. However, Peter still sank. Now, why was that? Why did Jesus tell Peter to come to him on the water when he knew that Peter was going to sink? See, because Jesus knew how all this was going to go down, right? And I don't mean he knew because he was the Son of God and he's omniscient and he knows all things. You don't have to be all-knowing to know that Peter was a little quick on the trigger. All right, that's just how Peter was, always putting his foot in his mouth, always a little ahead of himself. And so if Peter was clearly not ready to do this, then why did Jesus say, come? You know, a long time ago, I remember taking my daughter Ellie out for lunch when she was little, and I mean really little, like 18 months little. But she was at that age where she wanted to start doing things on her own, right? She wanted to eat by herself. She wanted to wash her hair by herself. She wanted to walk by herself. And so on this particular day, where in the past she was always like, Daddy, hold you, Daddy, hold you. Today she's saying, Ellie, walk, Ellie, walk. So I helped her out of the van on our way to this restaurant. And as we're walking through the parking lot, everything was fine until we got to the spot where the parking lot and the sidewalk meet, at which point she immediately stopped. She looked down at the curb that was in front of her, and she stuck her hand straight up in the air like this. Just waiting for me to grab it, right? So I took her hand and I helped her up the curb, and she immediately let go and ran into the restaurant all by herself. Well, that was several years ago, and I'm proud to say that Ellie can navigate that curb all on her own without my help anymore. But back then she couldn't. Now, does that mean that we should have just sat in the van until she got old enough to do it on her own? No, of course not. Because even though she couldn't navigate that curb at 18 months, I knew a day was coming when she could. But the day would never come if we just sat in the van and talked about it. We had to step out of the van and walk. James, the brother of Jesus, puts it this way: faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Now listen to what James is saying there. Unless we take action, our faith is dead. Not weak or sick, dead, like it doesn't even exist. See, faith by itself is never enough. And that is why Jesus says to Peter, come, when he knows he's going to sink. Because regardless of whether we succeed or fail, unless we take action, our faith is dead. What did Jesus say to Peter when he started to sink? Oh, you of little faith. See, I always thought walking on water would be a job for someone with big faith. If I was making a list of major accomplishments that required a lot of faith, walking on water would probably be at the top of the list. So why would Jesus allow a person of little faith to try and walk on water? Well, it's simple, really, when you have the right perspective. I'd rather attempt the impossible as a person of little faith than to stay in the boat for the rest of my life like a person whose faith is dead. See, I think for most of us here this morning, the issue isn't how much risk is involved. The issue is understanding what's at stake. I'll show you what I mean. Let's say that you have a great fear of public speaking. Okay? The last thing that you would ever want to do is stand up on a stage like this for 20 minutes and talk to a room full of people. However, what if I were to tell you that that friend or that family member that doesn't know Jesus that you have been praying for years decided that today was the day that they were going to church and give this God thing one more try? And what if I could tell you with absolute certainty that if you would simply come up front and share your testimony in front of everyone, share from your heart what Jesus has done for you, that that person who you have been praying for all of these years would finally surrender to Jesus right there on the spot? Would you do it? I mean, even if public speaking terrifies you, would you do it? Of course you would, because now you know what's at stake. See, Jesus knew what was at stake, and it wasn't water walking. Look, it's not like Jesus made it a habit of walking across the Sea of Galilee, like during his prayer time or something. He wanted Peter to be his partner. That's not what this was all about. Walking on water is cool and all, but in the grand scheme of things, how important really is it? See, Jesus was concerned about Peter's faith, just like he was concerned about all the disciples' faith, but not because he was trying to raise up a bunch of water walkers. The stakes were higher than that. And Jesus knew it. Jesus knew that in order for his disciples to have the faith necessary to do the work that he would eventually call them to do, Peter and his friends were going to have to experience some failures in the process. You know, there's a book by a guy named Erwin Lutzer called Failure, the Back Door to Success. Great book. Never read it. But the title alone challenges me. Nobody wants to fail, right? But you'll never succeed if you're afraid to fail. See, Jesus knew that the mission that he would be giving to Peter and the rest of the disciples required a lot of faith, big faith. You may have heard of this mission before. It's found in Mark chapter 16. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. That's a pretty big mission, isn't it? But what I want to highlight this morning is what Jesus said to his disciples right before that. This verse that you may not be as familiar with, verse 14. Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating, and he rebuked them for their lack of faith and for their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. Then Jesus said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Quite the pep talk, right? Like, what kind of locker room speech is that? Why immediately before Jesus sends his disciples out on this incredible mission does he call them out for their lack of faith? Because the mission is risky, even riskier than walking on water. But see, risk is part of the mission. It's not a mission if there is no risk. Which is why the answer, when we face these things in our lives, isn't to eliminate the risk, but to eliminate our lack of faith. To stop trusting ourselves. See, the Bible always presents trusting in ourselves and trusting in God as two mutually exclusive ways of living. In other words, you can't do both at the same time. But here's where we make it complicated. We try to figure out everything ahead of time in order to eliminate the risk. Or we waste our time trying to figure out what went wrong because we end up taking a risk and things don't turn out the way we think they should have. We need to understand that sometimes Jesus will say, come, when we're not prepared to come. Or go when we feel like we don't have the faith needed to go. He did that with his first disciples, and he does the same thing with us today. And so the question is, what opportunity or what obstacle is in front of you right now that maybe you feel like you're not ready for? I want you to just humor me for a second, close your eyes, and I want you to just picture what that is. Maybe it's something career-related or family-related. Maybe it's church-related, some ministry or some responsibility that you know you want to do, but you're not sure you're ready for it. Maybe it's surrendering your life to Jesus for the very first time. Whatever it is, submit it to him. And if he says, come, then have the courage to get out of the boat and follow him. And if you feel like you're starting to sink, don't panic. It's all part of the process. Okay, you can open your eyes. Risk is part of the process. Jesus knows that unless we're willing to take risks, our faith will never grow.